The summer heat settled over Memphis like a heavy blanket in 1954. The city sat on the banks of the Mississippi River, a place where the blues drifted from Beale Street clubs and cotton warehouses lined the waterfront. It was a time of change in America, when the Supreme Court had just ruled on school desegregation, and Elvis Presley was recording his first songs at Sun Studio. Life moved at a slower pace then. People knew their neighbors. Children played outside until dark. Nobody locked their doors. Nobody imagined that August would bring a crime so brutal it would haunt the city for 7 decades. Dorothy Ann Williams was 21 years old that summer. She worked as a telephone operator for the Memphis Telephone Company, one of hundreds of young women who sat at switchboards connecting calls across the city. She lived with her parents and younger brother in a modest house in the Cooper Young neighborhood, a working-class area where families sat on front porches in the evening and waved to passing cars. Dorothy was engaged to be married in October to a young man named Charles Henderson, a mechanic at a garage downtown. They had met at a church social 3 years earlier and had been inseparable ever since. On the evening of August 7th, Dorothy finished her shift at 6. She told her supervisor she was meeting her fiancé for dinner and a movie. The plan was to see a picture show at the Malco Theater on Union Avenue, then get ice cream at a drugstore soda fountain. Charles picked her up outside the telephone company building in his truck, a blue Ford he had restored himself. Coworkers saw them drive away, Dorothy waving from the passenger window, her smile bright in the fading light. They never made it to the theater. When Dorothy failed to come home by midnight, her parents began to worry. Her father called Charles's apartment. No answer. He called the garage where Charles worked. The night watchman said he had not seen him. By 2 in the morning, Dorothy's father drove to the police station to file a report. The officer on duty took down the information, but seemed unconcerned. Young couples sometimes lost track of time. They would probably turn up in the morning with an explanation and an apology. But morning brought something far worse than anyone could have imagined. A farmer driving his truck along a country road in Fayette County, about 40 miles east of Memphis, noticed something unusual in a drainage ditch near the tree line. He stopped to investigate and discovered 2 bodies, a young man and a young woman, lying partially concealed in tall grass. The woman was wearing a blue dress and white shoes. The man was in work pants and a button shirt. Both had been shot multiple times. The farmer ran to the nearest house and called the sheriff. Sheriff Wade Cunningham arrived at the scene within the hour. He was 56 years old, the career lawman who had served in Fayette County for 28 years. He had worked suicides, farm accidents, and the occasional domestic dispute that turned violent, but he had never seen anything like this. The victims appeared young, probably in their 20s. They had been executed, shot at close range with what appeared to be a small caliber handgun. Shell casings littered the area around the bodies. Whoever did this had emptied a gun into these 2 people and left them like discarded trash on the side of a road. The bodies were identified by mid-afternoon. Dorothy Ann Williams and Charles Raymond Henderson, both residents of Memphis, both reported missing the night before. The news traveled fast. By evening, reporters from Memphis newspapers were at the scene. Radio stations interrupted programming with updates. Dorothy's parents collapsed in grief. Charles's mother had to be sedated by a doctor. The community reeled from the shock. Who would do such a thing? Why would anyone want to harm 2 young people who had their whole lives ahead of them? The investigation began immediately. Detective Harold Mitchell from the Memphis Police Department was assigned to work with Sheriff Cunningham. Mitchell was 39 years old, a decorated veteran who had worked homicides for 8 years. He drove out to Fayette County and walked to the crime scene, studying the position of the bodies, the pattern of the shell casings, the tire tracks in the dirt nearby. This was not a random act. This was deliberate, cold-blooded murder. Evidence collection was limited by the technology of the time. Fingerprints could be lifted if surfaces were suitable, but there were no surfaces here except dirt and grass. Tight blood typing could distinguish between different donors, but DNA analysis would not exist for another 30 years. Shell casings were collected and marked, plaster casts were made of the tire tracks, photographs were taken from every angle. The bodies were transported to the county morgue for autopsy. The medical examiner determined that Dorothy had been shot 4 times, twice in the chest and twice in the head. Bullets were small caliber, likely from a .22 pistol. Both victims had defensive wounds on their hands, suggesting they had tried to protect themselves. The time of death was estimated between 9 and 11 the previous evening. The killer had likely forced them to drive out of the city, perhaps at gunpoint, then executed them on that lonely road. Detective Mitchell interviewed everyone who knew Dorothy and Charles. Family members, friends, co-workers, neighbors. Nobody could think of anyone who would want to hurt them. They had no enemies. They owed no debts. They were not involved in anything illegal or dangerous. They were ordinary young people planning an ordinary life together. Charles's truck was missing, and police issued a bulletin describing the vehicle. Finding the truck might lead to finding the killer. Three days after the murders, Charles's truck was discovered abandoned in a residential neighborhood in North Memphis, about 6 miles from where Dorothy lived. The vehicle had been wiped clean. No fingerprints were found on the steering wheel, door handles, or dashboard. The killer had been careful. Inside the truck, investigators found Dorothy's purse, but her wallet was missing. Charles's wallet was also gone. It appeared robbery might have been a motive, though the brutality of the crime suggested something more personal. Witnesses came forward with various sightings. The gas station attendant remembered serving a young couple in a blue truck on the evening of August 7th, but he could not recall the time or provide useful details. A woman reported seeing a blue truck parked on the side of a highway around dusk, but she had not stopped or noted the license plate. Every lead was followed, every tip investigated, but nothing pointed to a clear suspect. Sheriff Cunningham focused on the location where the bodies were found. The road was rural and rarely traveled at night. How did the killer know about it? Had they scouted the area beforehand? Were they familiar with Fayette County? He checked records of anyone with a criminal history who lived or worked in the area. He found several men with arrests for theft or assault, but none of them owned a .22 caliber pistol or had connections to Memphis. The investigation was stalling. Detective Mitchell believed the killer was someone who knew Memphis well enough to intercept Dorothy and Charles, but also knew the rural roads outside the city where a crime could be committed without witnesses. He theorized the killer might have flagged them down with car trouble or followed them and forced them off the road. Either way, it required planning and familiarity with both urban and rural geography. It was not the work of a drifter or a random stranger. This was someone who lived in the area, someone who blended into the community. Weeks turned into months. The case remained front-page news through September, but by October, other stories replaced it. Dorothy and Charles were buried in separate ceremonies, their families shattered by grief and unanswered questions. The wedding that should have happened that fall became a funeral instead. Detective Mitchell continued to work the case whenever he had time, but new crimes demanded attention. The file grew thick with reports and statements, but no arrests were made. By 1955, the case was cold. Sheriff Cunningham retired in 1962, never having solved the murder that haunted him for 8 years. Detective Mitchell died of a heart attack in 1968, leaving behind case notes and a promise to Dorothy's parents that he had never been able to keep. The physical evidence from the crime scene was stored in a warehouse, boxed and cataloged, slowly degrading as decades passed. Dorothy's younger brother, Thomas Williams, never forgot what happened to his sister. He was 13 years old when she was murdered, too young to understand the full weight of it, but old enough to remember her smile and the sound of her voice. As he grew older, he became obsessed with finding answers. He read every newspaper article about the case. He talked to retired officers who had worked the investigation. He kept photographs of Dorothy in his home and told his children about the aunt they would never meet. He never stopped hoping that someday someone would be held accountable. In 2018, Thomas Williams was 77 years old that summer. He had retired from his job as a school principal and spent his days gardening and volunteering at his church. One afternoon, he received a phone call from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. They were forming a cold case unit and reviewing unsolved homicides from previous decades. The Williams-Henderson double murder was among the cases selected for a renewed investigation. They wanted to know if Thomas would be willing to provide a DNA sample. He agreed immediately.
The cold case unit was led by Special Agent Rebecca Lawson, a 42-year-old investigator with training in forensic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis. She requested all physical evidence related to the 1954 murders. A search of the state evidence warehouse located a box that had been stored for 64 years. Inside were the shell casings, photographs, autopsy reports, and several pieces of fabric cut from Dorothy's dress. The fabric contained bloodstains that had been preserved, though partially degraded, over the decades. Agent Lawson sent the fabric samples to a private forensic laboratory that specialized in extracting DNA from old evidence. The process took 8 months. The lab used advanced techniques to isolate genetic material from the blood on Dorothy's dress. They successfully obtained a partial DNA profile that did not match Dorothy's DNA. It belonged to someone else, likely her killer, whose blood had mixed with hers during the attack. The profile was uploaded to genealogy databases that allowed law enforcement searches. Within weeks, Agent Lawson had results. The DNA matched several individuals who were distant relatives of the suspect. She began building family trees, tracing lineages back to people who would have been adults in 1954 and living in or around Memphis. The work was painstaking, requiring her to comb through birth records, marriage licenses, census data, and obituaries. The investigation led her to a family named Patterson, specifically to a man named Eugene Ray Patterson, who was 28 years old in 1954. Patterson had worked as a delivery driver for a wholesale company, a job that required him to travel throughout Memphis and the surrounding counties. He would have known both the city streets and the rural roads. Agent Lawson dug deeper into his background and discovered something chilling. Patterson had been arrested twice in the 1940s, once for assault and once for armed robbery. Both charges had been reduced through plea agreements. In 1956, 2 years after Dorothy and Charles were murdered, Patterson had been arrested for attempting to abduct a woman at gunpoint in Jackson, Tennessee. He served 4 years in prison and was released in 1960. After his release, Patterson had lived quietly in a small town in West Tennessee. He worked odd jobs, stayed out of trouble, and died in 1998 at the age of 72. He had never been connected to the Williams-Henderson murders. His name had never come up in the original investigation. But his criminal history and his geographic pattern fit the profile that Detective Mitchell had theorized decades earlier. Agent Lawson needed to confirm the DNA match. Patterson had been cremated, making direct comparison impossible. But he had children, 2 daughters who were still alive. Lawson obtained court orders to collect DNA samples from both women. The samples were analyzed and compared to the partial DNA profile extracted from Dorothy's dress. The results were conclusive. Eugene Ray Patterson was the source of the blood found on the victim's clothing. After 64 years, the killer had been identified. The revelation was announced at a press conference in Nashville. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation invited Thomas Williams and the surviving family members of Charles Henderson to attend. Agent Lawson detailed how modern forensic technology had finally provided answers that 1950s investigative techniques could not. She explained that while Patterson could not face trial, his name would forever be associated with the crime, and the families could finally have closure. Thomas Williams stood at the podium, his hands shaking, his voice breaking with emotion. He said he had waited 64 years for this moment. He said his parents had died without knowing who killed their daughter, and that pain had defined the rest of their lives. He said that learning the truth, even though it came far too late for justice in a courtroom, brought a sense of peace he had never expected to feel. He thanked Agent Lawson and the cold case unit for refusing to let his sister be forgotten. The case generated significant media attention across Tennessee and beyond. It became one of the oldest solved cold cases in the state's history. The story was covered by national news programs and true crime documentaries. Agent Lawson was invited to speak at law enforcement conferences about the techniques used to solve the case. She always began her presentations with photographs of Dorothy and Charles, two young people whose futures were stolen on a summer night in 1954. The resolution of the case prompted Tennessee authorities to allocate additional funding for cold case investigations. The TBI expanded its unit and began reviewing hundreds of unsolved homicides dating back to the 1940s and 50s. DNA evidence that had been stored for decades was sent for reanalysis. Several additional cases were solved in the years that followed, bringing closure to families who had waited generations for answers. Dorothy's family held a memorial service at the cemetery where she was buried. Thomas Williams, now 78 years old, stood at her gravestone and read a letter he had written to his sister. He told her that she had not been forgotten, that her life had mattered, that the person who took her away had finally been named. He said he would see her again someday, and when he did, he would tell her that justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. The case remains a testament to the power of persistence and the importance of preserving evidence even when immediate solutions seem impossible. Detective Mitchell and Sheriff Cunningham, who had worked the case in 1954 with the limited tools available to them, had documented everything meticulously. Their work, though it did not solve the case in their lifetimes, provided the foundation for the breakthrough that came 6 decades later. Their dedication was not in vain. Agent Lawson's daughters were devastated to learn what her father had done. They released a statement expressing sorrow for the victims and their families. They said they had not known about their father's violent past and were horrified to learn the truth. They hoped that the identification of their father as the killer would bring some measure of peace to those who had suffered for so long. The story of Dorothy Ann Williams and Charles Raymond Henderson is more than a cold case that was solved. It is a reminder that every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time has passed. It is a story about a brother who refused to let his sister's memory fade, who kept hope alive for 64 years. It is about investigators who used cutting-edge science to answer questions that previous generations could not. It is about a community that was forever changed by violence, but found a way to honor those who were lost. The summer heat still settles over Memphis every August, just as it did in 1954. The city has changed in countless ways. Beale Street still plays the blues, but the telephone company where Dorothy worked is long gone. The neighborhood where she lived has been renovated and rebuilt. The rural road in Fayette County where the murders occurred has been paved and widened, and few people remember what happened there 70 decades ago. But the story endures. Dorothy and Charles are not forgotten. Their names are recorded in the annals of solved cases, proof that time does not erase the need for truth, and that justice, however delayed, can still find its way home.